Like and subscribe to PalsFundamentals on YouTube for more videos like this. Okay, so today we're diving into a regional news report focusing on the Nordic Atlantic, specifically Greenland, Shetland, and the Faroe Islands. We're going to be looking at a whole bunch of different sources for this report. And just so you know, this report is going to be strictly factual, no opinions or speculation, just the information from our sources. And I think it's pretty timely, actually, especially what's happening in Greenland. We've got the Danish Prime Minister's visit coming up. And, there's that ongoing interest from the U.S. that just won't seem to go away.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there for sure.
Yeah. And then over in Shetland, things are heating up with some potential strike action. On the other hand, there's some good news for young people about ferry travel.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and in the Faroe Islands, well, we've got a kind of a bizarre public order incident to talk about, and also some local views on, well, wouldn't you know it, that U.S. interest in Greenland again. So why don't we start with Greenland? It seems like that's where a lot of the action is right now.
Definitely. And the upcoming visit from the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, is, well, it's significant. It's happening next week, Wednesday to Friday. And she's meeting with Jens Frederik Nielsen, who's the incoming premier, and the new government.
That's right. I mean, she's not wasting any time, getting over there right after the elections and, all the political wrangling that's been going on.
It seems like a pretty clear signal that she wants to keep those lines of communication open.
Yeah.
Especially with a new government coming in.
Exactly. And she said as much herself. She said it's all about continuing the good and trusting cooperation between Greenland and Denmark. And she even made a point of saying that it was important to visit quickly, given the recent democratic process that led to this, this new broad coalition government.
It seems like she really wants to emphasize that cooperative relationship.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on in Greenland right now. And, maybe this visit is about more than just, saying hello to the new government.
You're probably thinking about the whole U.S. interest in Greenland.
Exactly. That's the elephant in the room. And it's not exactly subtle either. I mean, Donald Trump recently came out and basically reiterated his past comments about potentially annexing the island. He even said he wouldn't rule out military force.
Which, it's pretty strong language to use, especially towards an ally, a NATO ally in this case.
I know. It's like, what happened to diplomacy?
Yeah, it's definitely raising eyebrows. Christian Rybjerg Madsen from the Social Democrats in Denmark, he was pretty vocal about it, disapproving of Trump's tone. He stressed that the U.S. is important for cooperation in the Arctic, but he was very clear that it has to be done with respect for Greenland's territorial integrity and for, Greenland's place within the Danish realm.
Right, right. It's like, hey, we can work together, but don't just assume you can walk in and take what you want.
Exactly. It has to be a partnership based on mutual respect, not, threats or intimidation.
It's interesting, though, the Danish foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, and the defense minister, Troels Lund Poulsen, they haven't really commented on Trump's remarks specifically. It makes you wonder what their strategy is here.
It does. But we do have some insight from John Bolton. He was the national security advisor under Trump.
Oh, yeah, Bolton. What does he have to say about this?
Well, he's predicting that the U.S. will neither take over Greenland nor actually use military force. He says it's unlikely that Congress would support those actions, from both sides of the aisle. And there's just a general lack of support for that kind of move.
I guess that's good to hear, coming from someone who was, right there in the thick of things during the Trump administration.
Exactly. And he went on to say that Trump's approach is actually hurting the trust between the U.S., Denmark, and Greenland, which is, not ideal, especially when you're trying to talk about things like Arctic security, which is a real concern with Russia and China becoming more active in the region.
Right. So Bolton's basically saying that Trump's bluster is backfiring.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And he also pointed out that this U.S. interest in Greenland isn't exactly new. He reminded everyone about those offers to buy Greenland back in the day.
Yeah.
Seward tried it in 1868, and then Truman gave it a shot in 1947.
Wow. So this has been going on for a while, but it sounds like Bolton thinks Trump's approach is, well, different.
Yeah. It's the bullying tone that's the problem. It's making it harder to have any kind of meaningful negotiations with Denmark or Greenland.
And then, there's that video Trump shared on Truth Social with the, the old war footage that looked like American soldiers fighting for Greenland. And his message was all about, standing together for peace and security in the future. It was a bit odd.
It was definitely a choice. And the Danish foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen responded directly to it.
Yeah.
He posted his own video, in English no less, and said basically that Denmark didn't appreciate the tone.
Wow, so it's like a public diplomacy battle playing out online.
It seems that way. And it's interesting that Rasmussen chose to respond so directly and publicly.
Yeah. You know, to understand the historical reference in Trump's video, we need to remember that the U.S. had a military presence in Greenland during World War II, and that was because of an agreement the Danish ambassador in Washington made while Denmark was occupied by the Nazis. So it's kind of a unique situation.
It is. And Søren Schultz-Hansen, who's a lecturer at CBS, he said that Trump bringing up the Nazi card in this context was extreme. But he also said it kind of reflects the level of intensity surrounding this whole debate about Greenland's future.
Like everyone's on edge and things are escalating quickly.
Yeah. And Troels Johannesson, who's a communications advisor, he said that Løkke Rasmussen's approach, focusing on the facts and mentioning the 1951 defense agreement between the U.S. and Denmark, which Greenland later co-signed, is more effective than what he called Trump's propaganda video.
So it's like a battle of messaging strategies, too.
Absolutely. And Sophie Rudd, she's a U.S. commentator, she pointed out that even though the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is visiting Greenland, and that could be seen as maybe, de-escalating things a bit, Trump's whole narrative about taking over Greenland, that's still circulating in conservative U.S. media.
So the idea is still out there.
It is. It's like it has a life of its own now.
Okay, so let's talk about Vice President Vance's visit. He landed at Pituffik Space Base, but the planned visits to Nuuk and Sisimiut were canceled. They're saying it was because of concerns about protests.
It seems like they didn't want to risk the bad press.
Yeah, I guess so. And Jens Frederik Nielsen, the incoming premier, he said that the visit happening before the new government was in place, that was disrespectful. He said it showed a lack of respect for an ally. But he also said that the new government is ready to get to work.
So he's not closing the door completely?
No, not at all. But he's definitely making it clear that Greenland won't just be pushed around.
It's about asserting their own agency in this whole situation.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a power outage at Pituffik around the time Vance arrived, which, probably just a coincidence, but still kind of strange.
It does add another layer of, oddness to the whole thing.
Definitely. Anyway, Vance made some interesting comments when he arrived. He said he respects Greenlanders' right to self-determination, but he also said that the U.S. could be a better security partner than Denmark. He even criticized Denmark's past efforts. It's like he's trying to, drive a wedge between them.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty clear attempt to position the U.S. as the more attractive option.
And in response to all of this, Jens Frederik Nielsen, he's really emphasizing the need for unity within the new coalition government because of all this external pressure. And it is a broad coalition, 4 parties representing something like 75% of the votes in Inatsisartut. And they're all about presenting a united front, especially when it comes to foreign and security policy.
That's a pretty strong mandate. It shows that there's a real consensus on the importance of unity in the face of these challenges.
Yeah. But it's also important to note that there are different views within the coalition. Vivian Motzfeldt from Siamod, she's the continuing foreign minister, and she's actually been more positive about the U.S. interest. She sees it as a potential opportunity for cooperation, but she's also very clear that Greenland is not for sale.
So it's not a monolithic bloc. There's room for different perspectives on how to engage with the U.S.
Right. And we came across an opinion piece on vp.fo by Gunnar Skuvadal, who's looking at this as a global competition for minerals. He's saying that the U.S. interest is part of a MAGA movement trying to expand U.S. territory. He even compares it to the U.S. interest in the Panama Canal in Canada in the past.
That's an interesting take. It suggests that the U.S. is driven by more than just security concerns. It's about resources and power.
Yeah. And it seems like the Danish government is pushing back a bit more rhetorically now. Lars Løkke Rasmussen, he responded to Vance's criticism of Denmark by reminding the U.S. about their long history in Greenland and all the agreements about military bases that are already in place.
It's like he's saying, hey, we've been partners for a long time. Don't forget that.
Exactly. And then Trump went on NBC and said that the U.S. will get Greenland 100%, and that there have been real conversations about annexation. And once again, he didn't rule out military force.
So he's doubling down on his stance.
Yeah. It seems like he's not backing down at all. But in response to all of this, there have been some shows of support for Greenland. In Aarhus, there was a demonstration organized by the student association Avalac. Hundreds of people showed up. to express their solidarity.
That's encouraging to see. It shows that people are paying attention and that they care about what's happening in Greenland.
And even the Danish royal house got involved. They posted on social media, quoting King Frederick expressing his love for Greenland and the Greenlandic people.
That's a pretty unusual move. It suggests that they're trying to project a sense of unity and support at a sensitive time.
It is, and the international media has been all over this story. The Guardian, SBS Australia, France 24, they're all reporting on Lars Løkke Rasmussen's video response to J.D. Vance, each with their own angle.
It's become a global story, and it's interesting to see how different outlets are framing it.
Yeah, and back in Denmark, there was another demonstration in front of the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen. Hundreds of people protesting Trump's ambitions for Greenland. They were holding signs that said things like, "Back off, USA," and "Grönland or ikke til salg," which means Greenland is not for sale.
So there's definitely public opposition to the idea of the U.S. taking over Greenland.
For sure. And KNR.GL, Greenland's national broadcaster, they're saying that those protests in Greenland might be why the U.S. canceled those visits to Nuuk and Sisimiut. They think the U.S. was worried about the bad publicity from demonstrations. You know, it would contradict their narrative that Greenland is actually open to being part of the U.S.
That makes sense. It's all about controlling the optics.
Right. But KNR.GL also says that even though the visits were canceled, the U.S. hasn't really changed their policy towards Greenland, which, they say, is all about geostrategic interests and access to minerals. And they say this interest goes back over 150 years.
This is a long game.
It is. And Gunnar Skuvadal, he's back on VP.fo with another opinion piece, and he's comparing U.S. influence to cultural imperialism. He's drawing parallels with what happened to the Inuit in Alaska and Canada, and he's warning against Greenland having a similar fate under U.S. influence. He even mentions Peter Mordam, who was worried about Anglo-Saxon cultural dominance and the need to protect the Danish language.
So it's not just about territory and resources.
Right.
It's about culture and identity, too.
Right. And on the diplomatic front, Mikkel Rengel Olsen, a researcher at DIS, he had an interesting suggestion. He said that the Danish royal house might be able to use King Frederick's, appeal to someone like Donald Trump to try and smooth things over.
So maybe a little royal diplomacy?
Maybe. But Olsen also said he's worried about Trump not ruling out military force. You know, especially compared to Vance, who seemed a bit less aggressive.
It's like there are two different approaches within the U.S. administration.
Right. And Olsen says the Danish government is in a really tough spot. There's no easy solution here. He also said that the idea of the Arctic being a low-tension area, that's pretty much gone, especially since 2022. And he said that Denmark has been slow to address surveillance tasks, which has given the U.S. something to criticize.
So Denmark's being squeezed from both sides.
Pretty much. And to finish up on Greenland, Alex Van Opsla, leader of the Liberal Alliance in Denmark, he said his party supports Greenland's self-governance. And he congratulated Democratic on their election win.
That's good to hear. At least there's some cross-party support for Greenland.
Yeah. So it's been a pretty bizarre week in Danish and Greenlandic politics. But maybe it's a good thing that Vance acknowledged Greenlanders' right to self-determination, and the new government, they're clearly focused on charting their own course.
It's definitely a pivotal moment for Greenland.
So let's shift gears and talk about Shetland.
Okay, well, things are getting a bit tense there with some potential strike action brewing. Council staff, who were represented by Unison, they voted overwhelmingly in favor of more strikes over pay. It was over 92% in favor. And this is after COSLA offered a 3% wage increase for 2025-26.
Wow, that's a pretty clear mandate for strike action.
It is. And it's happening at the same time that counselors are getting a pretty significant pay raise, something like 20 to 40% after a recent review.
Oh, wow. That's got to sting a bit for the council workers, seeing those kinds of discrepancies.
Yeah, it's understandable that they're frustrated.
Yeah.
Colette Hunter, who's the chairwoman of Unison Scotland's local government committee, she said that workers deserve a fair increase, one that keeps up with inflation, and that COSLA needs to, acknowledge the essential services that these workers provide. And she also said that they need to reverse years of pay restraint. They've been falling behind for a while.
So it's not just about this one pay offer, it's about a bigger picture of feeling undervalued.
Exactly. And she stressed that going on strike is always a last resort. Nobody wants to do that.
Of course not. And it's not just the council workers who are unhappy. Scottish Water staff, who are represented by the GMB and Unite unions, they've already started a rolling program of walkouts. They're protesting what they see as the arrogance of highly paid bosses, especially with all the recent bonuses that have been going around.
It's like they're saying, we're the ones keeping things running and we deserve to be compensated fairly.
Right. And this action by Scottish water staff, it could disrupt emergency repairs, testing, and essential maintenance. Things that people rely on.
Yeah, it could have a real impact on daily life. And Claire Greer, who's a GMB Scotland organizer, she said that this whole dispute could have been avoided. She criticized Scottish Water's negotiation tactics, saying that they changed their position during the talks.
So it sounds like there's a breakdown in communication and trust.
Yeah. And Scottish Water, for their part, they've said that strikes don't help anyone. They say their pay offer is fair and progressive and that it prioritizes lower-paid staff. And they've urged the unions to reconsider.
So it's a standoff for now.
It seems that way. But on a more positive note, there's some good news for young people in Shetland, as well as Orkney and the Western Isles.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
Well, starting next month, April 1st, young people under 22 will be able to travel for free on inter-island ferries.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic.
It is. It's a Scottish government scheme, and they're using the Young Scot, or National Entitlement Card, for foot passengers within their local council areas.
So it's making it easier for young people to get around and connect with each other.
Exactly. And it's part of a bigger plan, the island's connectivity plan and the 2025-26 transport budget. The goal is to make ferry services more affordable and sustainable. And it's also about improving access to things like education, employment, and other services for young people. Could even help address child poverty.
That's really forward-thinking.
It is. And the Transport Secretary, Fiona Hyslop, she said she's happy to be extending similar opportunities to island communities, like those that are already in place with free bus travel on the mainland. And she even said that they're committed to expanding free ferry travel to more young people in 2025-26.
So that's really good news for the future of these island communities. It shows a real commitment to their well-being.
It does. Okay, so let's move on to the Faroe Islands now.
Okay, what's happening over there?
Well, early this morning, there was a report about 2 men in Tórshavn who got fined for making offensive gestures at the police. Specifically, they were giving the middle finger, which in Faroese is called fuckfingeren or long tongue.
Wow, straight to the point.
They were fined for violating public order regulations.
I mean, it does seem like a pretty clear-cut case of, disorderly conduct.
Yeah. But one of the men also got another fine for refusing to identify himself and not following police instructions. So it sounds like he was being a bit more uncooperative.
Oh, wow, so he was really pushing it.
It seems that way. And then there was also a report of a violent incident involving some young people in Klaksvik overnight.
Oh, what happened?
Well, someone was taken to the hospital, and the police are going to be talking to everyone involved and their parents today.
So it sounds like it was pretty serious.
Yeah. We don't have all the details yet, but it definitely suggests that there's some tension among young people in that area.
It's worrying to hear about violence like that.
It is. And then we've got Gunnar Skufadal again, this time writing on VP.fo about the U.S. interest in Greenland and what it could mean for the Faroe Islands.
He seems to be quite concerned about that.
He is. He sees it as a form of English cultural imperialism. And he's really advocating for protecting the Faroes' language and culture. He's worried about the influence of English in the digital age.
It's interesting that he brings up the Faroes language specifically.
Yeah, he sees it as a key part of their cultural identity. And he uses historical examples, like what happened in Shetland, Ireland, and Orkney, as cautionary tales, places where the local language and culture have been eroded over time.
That's a valid concern. Globalization can have a homogenizing effect.
Exactly. And he's very critical of U.S. actions. He even calls what he sees as historical untruths from a Trump-associated Thule as vulgar American imperialism. And he contrasts that with English cultural influence, which he sees as more subtle but just as dangerous.
So it's like a two-pronged attack on Faroes culture.
That's how he sees it. And then he has another opinion piece on VP.4 reacting to Vice President Vance's visit to Greenland and the Danish response. He's looking at it as a bigger geopolitical struggle between the U.S. and the EU for influence in the North Atlantic. And of course, Greenland is right in the middle of that.
Right. It's a strategically important location.
It is. In Skufadal, he provides some historical context. He points out that the U.S. has considered Greenland part of its sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine, which was way back in 1823. And he mentions those past attempts to buy Greenland, like the one by President Truman. He also brings up the 1951 agreement that allows the U.S. to have military activity in Greenland, and the fact that Greenland isn't a member of NATO, where the U.S. has a lot of sway.
So there's a lot of history there.
There is. And he also talks about how U.S. foreign policy is shifting its focus from Europe to the Pacific, and how the U.S. is putting pressure on its European NATO allies to spend more on defense.
It's like the U.S. is trying to reassert its dominance in the region.
That's one way to look at it. And Scoville thinks that Trump's policy might be to encourage Greenland to break away from Denmark and the EU and form a free association with the U.S., similar to what they have with the Marshall Islands or Micronesia.
Wow, that would be a major shift in the geopolitical landscape.
It would. But Scoville also points out that there's not a lot of support for that idea within Greenland right now. Greenlandic politicians are saying they want to remain Greenlandic.
So it's a complex situation with no easy answers.
It is. And it'll be interesting to see how the new Greenlandic government navigates all of these challenges.
Okay, so to summarize all of that, we've got the ongoing U.S. interest in Greenland and all the different reactions from Denmark and Greenland with protests, diplomatic responses, and the Danish Prime Minister's visit coming up. In Shetland, there's the potential for strikes, but also the good news about free ferry travel for young people. And in the Faroe Islands, we've got a public order incident and some commentary about the geopolitical implications of the U.S. activity in Greenland.
And it's all happening against the backdrop of a changing Arctic, with increasing global interest in the region.
And remember, this report is based on the information from our sources, no opinions or speculation.
Just the facts. But it does raise a lot of questions about the future of these communities in the North Atlantic.
It does. So I'll leave you with this thought. How do you think these local events and these larger geopolitical forces are going to shape the future of these North Atlantic communities?
It's something to think about.
Sources linked below.